So the last number of weeks, people have been asking me, is it starting to set in? Is it starting to sink in the reality of what this next year is going to be? And it hasn't really started until we started to figure out, what we could take in our luggage, our suitcase, living on just a couple of bags for the next year. But I think this morning the reality is starting to sink in a little bit as to where we're going and what that's going to mean. And I really find it, I was thinking about, what would I be sharing on my final Sunday with you for a year? And I realized what a privilege it is to come before you week to week and speak to you about what I believe God is calling us to do and is calling us to live. And so I kind of circled through a few passages, and different passages kind of came to mind, and I thought, there's some interesting passages in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul is kind of saying farewell to a group of Christians that he was a part of. And I thought, well, maybe that would be a good passage to look at. The church in Ephesus, when Paul is leaving the church in Ephesus, they gather with him and they start to pray with him and for him. And I realized, we just had that with the kids, and that was fantastic. But if you know that passage, if you keep reading, you see that after they prayed for him, it was something I thought maybe we wouldn't be too comfortable doing here this morning, because they gather around him, they start to embrace him and start to weep and start to kiss him. And that might just get a little awkward and weird for some of you. So I thought, you know what, we're going to let you off the hook on that one, so I'm not going to go down that path. But what I found myself coming back to was this passage in the Old Testament, and it was essentially the calling of Samuel. Now, if you're familiar with Samuel, you may know his story as how he becomes one of the great prophets, one of the great priests of Israel, one who really leads Israel back from a difficult place into a much better relationship with God. And for whatever reason, I just kept circling back and back to this passage, because in this passage I begin to see what I hope part of my focus will be for this coming year. And what I'm going to suggest could potentially become a focus for all of you in this coming year as well. But in order to jump back into the story, I think it's always important for us to know the narrative, to kind of know a little bit about what else has been going on, because it may not be as familiar. And one of the dangers is we can just start plucking stories out of Scripture and fail to see just the bigger picture that they present to us and for us. Samuel comes at a time after Israel had been slaves in Egypt, as God delivered them, and then they wandered in the desert for 40 years, and then they came into the promised land, this land of Canaan. And Samuel arrives on the scene approximately about 300 years after the nation of Israel has settled in Canaan. And so things have become probably more comfortable for them. Things are becoming a little bit more established, or they're no longer wandering, they're no longer worrying. But I would argue it's when Samuel comes on the scene in the history of Israel, it is perhaps one of the lowest points for them up until that point. Lower than when they were slaves in Egypt, lower than when they were wandering in the desert for 40 years, kind of wondering, God, seriously, are we ever going to get there? Because these past 300 years, when Samuel enters the scene, they've taken a significant downturn. The book of Judges tells a lot about what happened, and because of the failure of the people to truly live life with God, they all began to go their own way. Absolutely, they still had the trappings of religion. They had priests, they had their prayers, they had their sacrifices. You could say they had the rites and the rituals, but they failed in the relationship. And it's here that we enter into a time with Samuel, in a place where God is going to be at work in their lives. I think one of the most fitting statements perhaps for this period of time comes at the end of the book of Judges, right before the book of Samuel. And the statement is made. And I think it's always important to know there's never a throwaway statement in the Bible, that it's placed there specifically by God for us to take notice. And the statement is simply this: everyone did as they saw fit. Essentially, people were living life according to their plans, according to what they wanted to do. And you started to see the downward spiral of people failing to follow in the ways of God. It wasn't just amongst a few. It had even leaked into the leadership of Israel, into the priesthood. There was 2 priests that were introduced to in the very beginning of the book of Samuel, who essentially were using their power and position within the nation for their own purposes. They would bully people through the sacrifices they were giving. They were living lives of just immorality, living lives that just God wasn't pleased with. And it's into this backdrop that we enter into this life of Samuel. And we're first introduced to his mom, a woman by the name of Hannah, as she was one of the people who were still following in the ways of God. Yet her problem, her difficulty was she was unable to have a child. And so she prayed and she prayed. She fervently and passionately prayed to God that if God would grant her request, that she would promise to then give this son back, to dedicate him back to the Lord. Well, you can probably imagine what happened. I mean, I wouldn't have given you that lengthy introduction to simply say, the story kind of stops there, folks. Sandwiches and drinks are downstairs, right? God grants her requests. And she remains faithful to her promise as well. That at the time of about 3 years old, when Samuel has been weaned, she then brings him to the temple. She presents him to Eli the high priest and dedicates him to the works of service to the Lord. And it's with that little backdrop that we now can kind of enter into this calling of Samuel that I hope begins to present a bit of a template for us as well, as we look forward to seeing what God has in store for us in this coming year. And so I invite Karen to come up and tell us a little bit more about the life of Samuel.
I'm reading from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 20. It's found on page 247 of the Old Testament in your pew Bibles. May God bless this reading from his word. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears of it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." Samuel lay down until morning, and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What is it that he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. and all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord.
So as you continue to read through the book of 1 Samuel, you're given a very quick overview in terms of the life of this young boy, who at the tender age of 3 was brought and presented at the temple, who would have grown up first initially more as a caretaker within the temple, the one who would open doors, the one who would make sure that things were clean, the one who would really come alongside and assist the priests. Little did he probably know that in the matter of years he would become the prophet and the priest of Israel, the great leader for the people of God. Not too bad when you consider the trajectory of his life. Started out in rather humble beginnings and just simply doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes necessary things, to rising to great leadership within Israel. I often wonder if one of the worries of when we read the Bible is we jump too far ahead in the story. We may be aware of Samuel and the great things that he did, the way in which he ministered, but perhaps at times we need to pull back, to go back to the very beginning and to see how God often works in the midst of people's lives, in the midst of certain situations. Because to every great ministry, to every great person of faith, there's always a very humble beginning. And I think what drew my attention back to the story of Samuel was how it all began, and how his life really provides a template as to what I believe God desires from all of us. And that is to have a sense of expectancy, to live life with an expectant faith. I don't think God created us just simply to go through the motions. God didn't create us just simply to rise to a place of intellectual assent to where we can agree to what God has said and we can stand and marvel at the beauty of his world, but rather God has created us to be in partnership with him. And partnership goes both ways. It's not only God at work in us, but it's God at work through us. We're not told specifically in the text, but I think it's obviously there, that Samuel lived his life with a certain amount of expectancy, a certain amount of expecting God to be at work not only in his life, but through his life as well. I mean, Samuel from the age of 3 grew up in the temple, but his parents still showed up once a year. His mom would provide him with a priestly robe. Year after year as he grew, have to get it bigger and bigger. And so he would have been aware that his parents were around and that his parents lived over there, yet he was here in the temple. And so like any curious boy, that's how God creates them. He would have asked the question, why am I here in this temple? And my family and all the other kids that would have grown up are over there. Why am I hanging out with all these older adults when I could be over there with my family? And so clearly someone must have told him the story. Someone must have let him in on it, whether it was his parents, whether it was Eli the priest, whether it was one of the other priests. They probably would have told him, listen, this is the story of your mom. This is the promise that she made to God of how she dedicated your life to service in the Lord. I think if we think about our lives, when we think about a decision to truly live life with God, we essentially are making that same promise that Hannah made for Samuel. That when we step into that place of saying, Jesus, I want to follow you, faith doesn't simply become an accessory or something we put on and then take off. Faith becomes that which guides and directs us in all of life. And along with that comes a sense of expectation that God is not only going to be at work in us, but that God is going to be at work through us. And so the first place I find myself coming to is in asking that honest question. Do I expect God to be at work in my life? Do I honestly expect God to use me in the building of this, his kingdom? Because we can get caught up in saying the right things and in sometimes doing the right things, and we can talk a lot about partnership and how God is going to be at work in us. But do we live in such a way? Do we respond in such a way that we believe that God is going to be at work in us and God is going to be at work through us? Because when we do, suddenly our perspective begins to change. Not only with regards to faith, but ultimately with regards to our own life as well. I think one of the great gifts that Samuel gives to us is he begins to give us a bit of a template, some handles that we can hold on to have a better understanding as to what does expectant faith look like. Because I think I'd be doing a disservice to you, I'd be doing a disservice to this passage if I just simply said, okay, we need to have an expectant faith, we need to expect God to act, and then we go out and we sometimes get all riled up and fired up, say, okay, I'm going to be expectant. But what does that look like? And I think in the story in Samuel, we're given some evidence as to some tangible realities as to what expectant faith begins to look like. I'm not saying these are the only ones. There's probably other ones out there, but I just want to give us a little bit of a bite size here this morning. So that if we truly want to live all of life with God, if that becomes more than just words we speak, we can start to see some of the realities, some of the markers in our life, some of the signposts that will help us as we continue to walk in faith with God. I think the very first thing we see in Samuel is that because he had a sense of expectant faith, that he was faithful and intentional in the small things. Too often we may get caught up in situations of thinking, okay, God, how are you going to use me? What is the next big thing? What is the next great ministry? But if you scale it back, if you look at all of the ministries of this church, if you look at the ministries in this world, if you look at the things that God is at work in, it starts with people being faithful and intentional in the small things. Because when we're faithful, intentional in the small things, God begins to open the door to even greater things as well. Samuel started out as the lowest rung on the ladder. He was doing the simple things, the ordinary things. But there's this interesting verse that is used as a tagline to describe what his growing up would be like, to describe what his adolescent years would be like. I know some of you have adolescent children, and if you were to use words to describe what those years are like, we may see some similarities, we may see some differences. I was trying to ask my parents, what were my adolescent years like? If you could use one or two words to describe them, what would they be? I can't share those with you here this morning. I'm still trying to get over it here. The word awkward and unexpected came up at times and different things. But the two words that were used to describe the adolescent years of Samuel was that he was one who grew in favor and stature with God and with others. He was someone who grew in reputation and approval, first of all with God, and then with others. We're not told all the details about what he did. If you read through the Bible, you see there's often great leaps, and you got to kind of figure out some of the details. But clearly what we see from there, because Samuel was someone who expected God to be at work in his life, he began by being faithful and intentional in the small things. When we live with a sense of expectation, we live with the sense of knowing that God is going to use us, but we may not always know how, when, where, what the timing may be. Life would be a lot easier, you may agree with me, if God would just give me his 5, his 10, his 15-year plan. But it hasn't happened yet. And so what does God ask us to do? He says, give me this day. Give me this moment. Be faithful to me in this situation, in this relationship, in this ministry, and then allow me to continue to be at work in you. And so an expectant faith is this sense of being faithful, being intentional in the small things, in the mundane things, in the boring things, in sometimes the things we wish someone else would do. God, really? You want me to do that? Expectant faith doesn't mean that we always figured out the first time. And I think we need to understand the reality of this. I love the fact, for a variety of reasons, that it took God 4 times to get Samuel's attention. I felt slightly convicted this week that when I call my children for dinner, maybe I should give them a bit of a pass on that, right? Like if they don't answer the first time, maybe 2 or 3 more times. But I think we can start to see that sometimes we have a sense of expectant faith. It doesn't mean we always figured out the first time. Sometimes God has to be speaking into our lives, but what it does mean is we become more aware of those circumstances, those situations, those people that seem to be circling back into our life. You know, I heard someone say, this is not a word of mine. I don't know who said it. If I knew who it was, I'd give him credit for it this morning. But it's like when God kind of niggles at you. God kind of needles you a little bit. God kind of stays at work with you. And you think, there's a situation that just doesn't seem to resolve itself. And it's like we have a boomerang prayer, right? You pray and you fire it off to God and, you want him to sort it out. But next thing you know, the prayer lands back at your feet. And like, oh, okay. Or there's a certain person that maybe comes to mind. Or there's maybe a decision or a situation that you're praying through. And God is, sometimes it's a sense of dissatisfaction. Have you ever viewed dissatisfaction in your life as a way of God maybe getting your attention to say, this is an area that I want you to step into? And so when you live with a sense of expectation that God is going to use you, suddenly you're more prone to step into those places. You become more aware of things that just keep circling back like a boomerang and saying, maybe this is from God. And so I love what we see from Samuel is that he couldn't even figure it out on his own. He needed Eli to tell him. Eli finally, after the 3rd time, tells Samuel, okay, I've locked this in. This is from God. You need to listen to him. When we have expectant faith, we begin to gather people around us who can support us, who can encourage us, who can help us understand sometimes the directions that God is leading us in. I think one of the dangers that we may fall into here in Canada is a sense of a private faith, a sense of an individualistic faith, a sense of we need to figure it out together. But if you read through the Bible, if you see what God desires, faith is meant to live and grow in community. For Rebecca and I, for our decision to go to Malawi, it started out in a direction that we kind of thought was what would work out well for us. As some of you are aware, it started out as a conversation around leaving for a 2-month vacation to go away in July and August and to go back to Malawi. And we seemed like a good idea. It seemed like everything was going to work out. And then just God sticks his thumb into it and says, I'm gonna swirl that around a little bit and change things up. And through a couple conversations over dinner that I thought, maybe they're not going to go anywhere, it expanded out into a year. But in the midst of that whole process, Rebecca and I were in conversation not only with ourselves, but with our families and with our friends, and just asking them, what do you think about this? Is this a good decision? Is this a helpful decision? Is this the right decision? I can still remember the Tuesday night when I came in to talk to Session about what we were about to propose. And I was trying to find the words, and I wanted to cut to the chase quickly. And I didn't know what the response was going to be. But I remember that within a matter of moments, the conversation quickly shifted from, of course you're going to go and do this, to how can we make it work? I then remember the Sunday morning where I came and I told, well, most of you. And the response again was a sense of celebration. I mean, I have to say, I was a little taken aback. It's probably the first time I ever got applause in a church, and it was after I told you I was leaving. You didn't let me get to the part that I said I want to come back, but hey, there's the answer. God answers in mysterious ways. But what's been really amazing for me and for Rebecca is a sense of support and encouragement that we have received through emails, through conversations, through people just coming up to us. In many ways, you have been my Eli. You have been the ones who have come alongside and have just, again, confirmed what God has put in our heart. And so do you have those people in your life? Do you have people that you can talk to them about, is this where God is leading me? Is this what God is wanting to do in my life? Because I think one of the great realities that we see in the life of Samuel is that when you live with a sense of expectant faith, there'll be times of unease. There'll be times of fear. There'll be times of uncertainty. God spoke to Samuel what was about to happen to Eli. Remember those rotten priests I talked about earlier? Those were Eli's two sons. The ones who were supposed to take over the leadership of the church of Israel. But because of their inability, God says, no more. And because of Eli's inability to reign control over his children, he too was going to be removed. And Samuel would be the one who would be raised to prominence. Could you imagine having to give that message to your mentor, to your friend, to someone who essentially acted as a father figure? I think to say Samuel was fearful would be to put it mildly. But one of the great realities is for Samuel, if he was going to continue in the ways of God, there was going to be moments where he would have to steady himself and to say, God, if you're not in this, I'm going to fall flat on my face. I'm always struck by the reality of one of the most common phrases in the Bible is, fear not. Don't be afraid. And it must be there because obviously when God calls people into new places and into new circumstances, their first reaction isn't jump up for joy, let's charge the cavalry ahead. It's, ooh, God, you want me to do what? You want me to go there? I'm not so sure. I think it's healthy. I think it's acceptable. That when we live with a sense of expectation that God is going to use us, there's going to be moments in our life when there's going to be uncertainty. There's going to be unease. There's going to be a bunch of fear. As I think of our time in Malawi, absolutely we're excited. Absolutely we're looking forward to going. But I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't afraid. There's a sense of uncertainty. There's a sense of certainty. There's a sense of knowing what it is we're going back into, some of the circumstances, some of the situations, some of the challenges. There's a sense of concern over that which we don't fully know. But I find myself coming to a place of saying, God, you're in this. And so I'm going to step out in faith. We're going to step out in faith. And we're going to continue down the path that we believe you are leading us towards. Probably one of my favorite passages in the Bible is when Jesus tells us the reason why he came. Kind of helpful thing to know. He says, I have come so that you may have the abundant life. Abundance can be defined in a variety of ways. It can be defined by stuff, accumulation, good health, good things. I don't think that's what Jesus meant when he said abundance. I think he spoke of meaning, purpose, satisfaction. Jesus has said, I have come so that you will have a meaningful life. I have come so that you will have a life truly worth living, a life that doesn't end, a life that extends into all of eternity. It's a life that's not always easy. It's a life that's not always comfortable. It's a life that sometimes calls us into places that we may not have gone on our own. But it's a life we choose because we know that God is the one who knows that which is best for us. And so my focus this year is to have an expectant faith. We're going to Malawi, and we know certain things, we think certain things are going to play out a certain way. But there's other things that I have no clue as to how it's going to go. But I expect and I know that God is going to show up. To not only be at work in my life, but to be at work through my life. And so my hope and my prayer for all of you is that as I share our experiences with you, that you will be sharing your experiences with us as well. That you too will live life with a sense of expectancy, with a sense of knowing that God is not only wanting to be at work in your life, but that God is going to be at work through your life as well. Because the Bible seems to tell us over and over and over again that we have a choice to make. The book of Judges tells us the choice that the majority of the people took. They did whatever was right in their own eyes. And we saw the downward spiral. Jesus invites us to something greater. Something that began before us, is continuing through us, and will carry on long after us. It's the building of his kingdom. And so he invites us to come. He invites us to come and experience the incredible wonder, the incredible opportunity of what life is lived like with a sense of expectancy, of trusting that God is going to be at work in your life. Because like Samuel, that's where it starts. It's so often too easy to look back after you've accomplished great things, but fail to forget that it started with that moment of saying, God, I'm going to be intentional. I'm going to be faithful in the small things. And when you call me into places that may bring a certain sense of uncertainty, a certain sense of fear, a certain sense of trepidation, I am going to continue to trust in you. Because you know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. And so God bless. My follow-up will be in 12 months. Please stand as we sing together.